The 1960s sparkle in memory, rock and roll blasting from jukeboxes, kids riding their bikes down quiet streets, and families gathering at drive-in theaters under the glow of the big screen. It was a time that seemed lighter, freer, and filled with possibility. Summer nights stretched on, with children playing outside until the streetlights flickered on, and parents didn't worry much about where they were. It felt safe. It felt familiar. Yet beneath all that charm, there were everyday habits and choices that would shock us now. What was once completely normal in that decade could land someone in serious trouble today. The country itself was riding on optimism. The post-war boom had given families steady jobs, suburban homes, and the promise of a brighter future. Rules felt looser, and the idea of regulation was something most people rarely thought about. Products were used without warning labels. Cars rolled off assembly lines without much thought to safety, and parents trusted that what they bought or what doctors recommended was fine. There was a faith in the system that made people more relaxed, more willing to go with the flow. Neighbors didn't just know each other. They depended on each other. Families left their doors unlocked. Children walked to school without a second thought, and teenagers hitchhiked across town without setting off alarms. It was a culture where trust carried more weight than caution. Parents believed that teachers, doctors, and companies all had their best interests at heart. That trust gave people comfort, but it also meant few questions were asked about whether something was truly safe. Many of the things taken for granted back then would never pass today's standards. A family car was considered complete if it had a radio and shiny chrome bumpers, not seatbelts in the back seat. Playgrounds were built high, with hard concrete below, and no one handed out helmets for bikes or roller skates. Children could buy candy cigarettes and mimic the adults around them without anyone blinking. Adults smoked at work, in restaurants, and even around children, with ashtrays on nearly every surface. The idea of secondhand smoke hadn't entered the conversation yet. It wasn't just about products or public spaces. The very rhythm of daily life showed how different priorities were. Families sat down for dinner together without fear of distractions from phones or constant schedules, but they also accepted risks that would seem reckless now. Drinking and driving was more socially tolerated. Chemicals filled household products, and playground games were designed for thrill over protection. Freedom mattered more than safety, and that mindset shaped an entire culture. Looking back, it's easy to feel torn. There's nostalgia for the simple pleasures, the open doors, the friendly neighbors, the trust that seemed to make life slower and easier. But there's also a sharp awareness that this freedom carried costs, sometimes hidden until years later. Childhood memories of summer nights and Saturday mornings are tinged with the knowledge that people lived among dangers they didn't recognize at the time. That is what makes the 1960s so fascinating. A decade that felt safe on the surface, but was built on practices that would never be allowed today. It was freedom without boundaries, optimism without caution. And while it gave people memories they still cherish, it also paved the way for the changes and restrictions we live with now. So let's step back into that world, starting with what was once common in medicine. In the 1960s, a doctor's word was law. If a doctor handed you a prescription, recommended a product, or reassured you about a treatment, most people didn't think twice. Trust in the medical profession was absolute, and that trust allowed practices to slip through unchecked that would never pass today's standards. What felt like progress in the moment often carried risks that only came to light years later. Cigarettes are one of the most shocking examples. Advertisements proudly featured doctors in white coats claiming certain brands were better for your throat, or even medically approved. It wasn't too unusual to see a respected physician in an ad suggesting that smoking a particular brand meant you cared about your health. With that kind of endorsement, millions of Americans lit up without questioning the long-term effects. The dangers of smoking weren't widely acknowledged, and the connection between cigarettes and cancer was still debated in public. Prescription drugs followed a similar pattern of unquestioned trust. Medications were released with little of the rigorous testing required today, and the Food and Drug Administration had fewer safeguards in place. Pills were handed out casually, often without clear instructions or warnings. If a doctor prescribed it, patients assumed it was safe. Many medications were marketed as miracle cures, only for their serious side effects to surface years later. Experimental treatments were often given to patients without thorough explanation. Clinical trials had loose oversight, and the concept of informed consent was almost non-existent. Patients weren't always told about the risks or even that they were part of an experiment. Doctors were seen as authority figures, and challenging their word felt unthinkable. One of the darkest chapters was the prescribing of thalidomide to pregnant women. Marketed as a harmless way to ease morning sickness and help with sleep, the drug was distributed widely in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Thousands of babies were born with severe birth defects as a result. The tragedy sparked outrage and forced sweeping changes in how drugs were tested and approved. It became one of the turning points that showed the danger of blind trust in medicine. Even outside of such scandals, the everyday culture of medicine was built on authority over transparency. Patients didn't expect detailed explanations or second opinions. Doctors spoke, and patients listened. That system made people feel secure, but it also left them vulnerable to mistakes, oversights, and risks hidden behind polished ads and confident voices. Out of these painful lessons came stronger safety regulations. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, new laws began requiring more extensive testing for drugs, stricter rules for advertising, and better protection for patients. The shift from blind trust to careful regulation reshaped American medicine. Still, memories remain of a time when doctors could casually recommend a cigarette or a pill without ever being challenged. But medicine wasn't the only place where risks were brushed aside. Home life held its own dangers. Families in the 1960s believed their homes were safe havens. The front door was often left unlocked. The neighbors were trusted, and children played freely in the yard. Yet inside those walls, hidden dangers lurked in everyday objects. Dangers that no one at the time fully understood. What seemed ordinary back then has since been revealed as hazardous, with effects that lasted for decades. Lead-based paint was one of the most common threats. It was everywhere on walls, doors, and even children's toys. Parents painted nurseries in cheerful colors, never realizing that lead dust could flake off and be inhaled or swallowed. Kids played with brightly painted toy cars or blocks, sometimes putting them in their mouths, with no warnings about the risks. It wasn't until much later that doctors connected lead exposure to developmental problems, learning disabilities, and lifelong health issues. By then, an entire generation had already been exposed. Asbestos was another invisible danger, used so widely in construction that it seemed impossible to avoid. Insulation in attics, tiles on floors, and even the protective lining inside hair dryers contained asbestos fibers. Builders praised it for being fire-resistant and durable, while families had no idea that breathing in tiny particles could scar the lungs and cause deadly diseases decades later. At the time, no one questioned its presence. It was simply considered a modern material for a modern home. Cleaning products also reflected the efficiency over safety mindset of the era. Harsh chemicals were freely available and marketed as miracle solutions for housewives determined to keep a spotless home. Ammonia, bleach, and solvents were used daily, often in poorly ventilated rooms without gloves or masks. Children inhaled fumes, pets were exposed to spills, and warnings about toxic reactions were rare. These products made chores easier but came with unseen costs. Everyday routines meant kids encountered risks constantly. Crawling across freshly painted floors, breathing in asbestos from heating systems, or helping their mothers polish furniture with chemical sprays were all normal parts of life. Parents felt proud of modern homes filled with the latest products, never suspecting that their children's health was quietly being shaped by hidden toxins. The long-term effects only became clear years later. Doctors started linking lung disease to asbestos, connecting lead exposure to behavioral problems, and identifying how cleaning chemicals contributed to respiratory issues. By the 1970s and beyond, laws were passed to ban lead-based paint, phase out asbestos, and regulate dangerous household products. But those changes came too late for many families who had already lived with the consequences. Looking back, the 1960s home feels like a paradox. It was the place where families gathered, shared meals, and built memories. At the same time, it was filled with silent hazards hiding in walls, floors, and cupboards. What looked like progress, brighter paint, durable materials, powerful cleaners turned out to be some of the most dangerous choices of the era. And if the home was risky, the streets of the 1960s were even more shocking. Seatbelts? Optional? Car seats? Almost unheard of. Driving in the 1960s was celebrated as the ultimate expression of freedom, but behind the wheel, it was often chaos. The open road called to Americans, promising independence and adventure, yet safety was rarely the focus. Cars were bigger, faster, and flashier than ever before, but they were not built with protection in mind. For families piling in on weekends or teenagers cruising down Main Street, risk was simply part of the ride. At the time, only a handful of states even required seatbelts to be installed in cars, and almost no one actually used them. Lap belts, if available at all, were often tucked away under the seat, ignored, or considered unnecessary. Children sat in the front passenger seat, sometimes standing on the bench to get a better view out the window. Babies might be held in a parent's arms or placed in makeshift carriers that offered no real restraint. The idea of a crash test dummy hadn't yet become part of public awareness, and parents assumed that holding on tightly would be enough to keep their children safe. Drinking and driving was also far more socially tolerated. A driver might have a few beers at a bar or a couple of cocktails at a dinner party and still get behind the wheel without much thought. Police rarely enforced DUI laws the way they do today, and public awareness campaigns about the dangers of drunk driving were still years away. For many, it was simply part of the culture, accepted as a normal part of social life. The design of the cars themselves added to the danger. Automakers prioritized sleek lines, tail fins, and chrome over safety features. Steel dashboards, sharp steering columns, and glass windshields without shatterproof technology meant that even minor accidents could cause serious injuries. Safety features we now take for granted, like airbags, anti-lock brakes, and crumple zones, didn't exist. A collision in a 1960s car was often far more devastating than it would be today. Families thought little of piling into the car for a road trip, kids unrestrained in the back seat, sometimes lying across the rear window ledge or even napping on the floor. Teenagers treated cars as symbols of independence, racing down highways or drag strips without helmets or protective gear. The sense of thrill outweighed the thought of consequences. It wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s that attitudes began to shift. The rise of organizations pushing for highway safety, new federal regulations, and growing awareness of drunk driving dangers brought about sweeping changes. Seatbelt laws became mandatory, car seats were required for children, and automakers started redesigning vehicles to prioritize protection. Campaigns like "Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk" began to reshape public culture. Looking back, driving in the 1960s feels almost reckless compared to the standards of today. It was freedom at full speed, but it came with risks that left countless families with stories of loss. The cars themselves were cultural icons, but they also symbolized an era when style and independence mattered more than survival. But danger wasn't just on the roads. Sometimes it was built right into childhood fun. The slides were tall, the merry-go-rounds spun fast, and nobody wore a helmet. Childhood in the 1960s was thrilling, but it was also filled with danger hiding in plain sight. Parents saw playgrounds and toys as a chance for kids to be adventurous, tough, and independent. Looking back now, some of those everyday experiences feel shocking, almost unbelievable compared to the strict safety rules of today. One of the most vivid memories of 1960s playgrounds was the towering metal slide. On a hot summer day, the surface baked in the sun until it could burn bare legs. Kids lined up anyway, shrieking as they slid down, sometimes too fast to stop safely at the bottom. Jungle gyms were built high and sturdy, but they were placed over hard concrete or packed dirt. If a child slipped from the top rung, there was nothing to cushion the fall but the ground. Bruises, broken arms, and scraped knees were almost a rite of passage. Lawn darts were another childhood staple, marketed as fun for the whole family. They were sharp, heavy, and designed to be tossed through the air into plastic rings on the lawn. To adults, they seemed like harmless entertainment. To kids, they were weapons waiting to cause accidents. Emergency rooms saw the results, but at the time, few questioned why such dangerous toys were sold in the first place. Firecrackers and backyard fireworks added to the excitement. 4th of July celebrations often turned into do-it-yourself displays, with kids lighting fuses and dodging sparks. Safety goggles or ear protection were unheard of. Firecrackers were treated like playthings, handed to children as casually as sparklers. For many families, the noise and chaos were part of the fun, even though the risk of burns or worse was always close by. Even the simplest joys carried danger. Riding a bicycle was a symbol of childhood freedom, but helmets were rare. Children raced through neighborhoods without pads or protective gear, sometimes doubling up on handlebars or riding barefoot. A scraped knee was expected, and more serious crashes were brushed off as part of growing up. Parents believed in resilience, trusting kids to learn their limits the hard way. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, attitudes began to change. Accidents piled up, studies revealed the dangers, and new laws were introduced to restrict or ban many of these practices. Lawn darts were pulled from the shelves, fireworks faced tighter regulation, and bike helmets became standard. Playgrounds were redesigned with softer ground materials and safer equipment. What was once normal slowly became unthinkable. For those who grew up in the 1960s, memories of these perilous playgrounds still bring a mix of nostalgia and disbelief. The freedom to climb, fall, and try again built confidence and courage, but it also left scars, both visible and hidden. Childhood back then was daring and wild, shaped by risks that parents today would never allow. But danger wasn't limited to playtime. Schools themselves had rules that would never fly today. School discipline in the 1960s looked very different, and some of the punishments that were routine back then would land a teacher in serious trouble today. Classrooms were stricter, authority was absolute, and the belief was that tough discipline built character. But beneath the surface of that order were practices that often caused more harm than good, shaping memories of school that could be as painful as they were formative. Corporal punishment was not only accepted, it was expected. Teachers and principals kept wooden paddles in their offices, and students knew that misbehavior could earn them a swift public spanking. A slap across the knuckles with a ruler or being yanked by the ear was considered normal classroom management. Parents often supported it, believing that harsh discipline at school reinforced values at home. The idea that a child might have legal protection against such treatment was almost unthinkable. Even more surprising to modern eyes, some high schools designated smoking areas for students. Teenagers could light up between classes, sometimes alongside their teachers. Cigarette ads aimed at young people were everywhere, and the health risks were not taken seriously. The image of students leaning against the school wall, puffing on cigarettes during breaks was so common it barely raised an eyebrow. Today, it would cause outrage. Bullying and hazing were also treated with indifference. Teachers rarely intervened unless things turned violent, and verbal taunts or roughhousing were seen as part of growing up. Hazing rituals in sports teams and clubs could be cruel or dangerous, but adults often looked the other way. Without clear oversight, students had to navigate the social hierarchy on their own, leaving many with scars that lasted far beyond graduation. Segregation also lingered in schools across parts of America, despite the Supreme Court's ruling in 1954 that declared it unconstitutional. By the 1960s, integration was slowly progressing, but resistance remained strong in many communities. Children of color often faced hostility, unequal resources, and the daily reminder that the classroom was not the same for everyone. Gender roles shaped education too, with girls steered toward home economics and boys pushed into shop classes, reflecting a culture that set limits on what each was expected to become. The reforms that came later dramatically reshaped education. Laws banned corporal punishment in most states. Smoking was driven out of schools entirely, and anti-bullying measures became a core responsibility of educators. Segregation gave way, at least legally, to more equal access, and opportunities for girls expanded alongside shifting cultural expectations. Classrooms became not just places of learning, but battlegrounds for fairness, safety, and respect. Looking back, the 1960s classroom was both strict and shockingly unregulated. Students learned to follow rules without question, but they also endured treatment that would never be tolerated now. The mix of discipline, neglect, and inequality shaped a generation in ways that still echo today. And when school was out, teenagers had their own freedoms that shock us today. Hitchhiking, joyrides, and unsupervised nights. Teenagers in the 1960s enjoyed freedoms that parents today would never dream of allowing. It was an era defined by independence, where young people tested limits in ways that now feel reckless. The culture of the time encouraged exploration, and society largely turned a blind eye to risks that, in hindsight, were far too great. Hitchhiking was one of the most common sights on American roads. Teens stuck out their thumbs without hesitation, trusting that strangers would give them a ride. It wasn't unusual for kids to travel miles this way, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. Parents often assumed it was harmless, and drivers saw it as a civic duty to help someone get where they were going. What is now seen as incredibly dangerous was once viewed as adventurous and normal. Cars themselves became symbols of teenage freedom. A driver's license opened up the world, and once a teen had access to a car, oversight was minimal. Cruising around town, piling friends into the back seat, and racing down country roads were all part of the culture. Seatbelts were rarely worn, and police presence was limited. The thrill of driving was paired with risks that most young drivers didn't fully recognize. The drinking age in many states was lower than it is today, and enforcement was often lax. Teenagers could buy alcohol more easily, and underage drinking was brushed aside as part of growing up. Social gatherings and high school parties sometimes involved alcohol without parents interfering, and the dangers of impaired driving weren't fully emphasized until years later. Cigarettes were another rite of passage. Smoking was not only accepted, it was glamorized. Movie stars, athletes, and even teachers were seen with cigarettes, and teens followed suit. Packs could be bought cheaply, sometimes even from vending machines. Lighting up was a way to look older, to fit in, and to imitate adulthood, with little understanding of the health consequences. Parents also gave teenagers far more unsupervised time than they do now. Without cell phones or tracking apps, curfews were loose, if they existed at all. Kids might say they were going out for the night and return hours later with little explanation. That level of trust reflected the culture of the era. but it also exposed teens to risks that parents today would find unimaginable. As the decades went on, society began to pull back on that freedom. Laws tightened around drinking and driving. Smoking was pushed out of teen culture, and hitchhiking disappeared under the weight of fear and crime. Technology gave parents new ways to monitor their kids, while schools and communities emphasized safety over independence. What was once a carefree teenage adventure is now remembered with a mix of nostalgia and disbelief. But some practices weren't just risky. They were unfair and eventually outlawed. The 1960s promised freedom, but left risks hiding in plain sight. Looking back, the memories feel golden: children racing bicycles until dusk, families gathering at drive-ins, neighbors waving from front porches. Yet woven into those moments were habits and choices that would later be outlawed. Cigarettes endorsed by doctors, homes filled with lead paint and asbestos, cars without seatbelts, and classrooms where paddles hung on the wall. Playgrounds turned into accident sites. Teenagers hitchhiked without fear. And deep inequalities shaped who was allowed to feel truly free. Nostalgia can make those years shine brighter than they were. The laughter of kids on metal slides, the excitement of cruising in chrome-trimmed cars, and the feeling of trust between families are powerful images. But behind them stood dangers and injustices that often went unnoticed until decades later. What felt like freedom was sometimes risky, and what felt ordinary could prove unfair or unsafe. That tension between comfort and danger defines much of what we remember about the 1960s. The laws that followed were not meant to erase freedom, but to balance it with protection. Seatbelts saved countless lives. Bans on asbestos and lead removed silent threats from homes, and reforms in schools gave children safer and fairer places to learn. Teenagers lost some of their wild independence, but gained protections that helped more of them grow safely into adulthood. And civil rights movements pushed the country toward a broader, more inclusive idea of freedom, one where race, gender, or identity no longer dictated opportunity in the same way. Progress has not been perfect, but the changes remind us of how resilient culture can be. What once seemed unshakable, the cigarette in every hand, the unchallenged authority of teachers and doctors, the segregation of schools eventually shifted. People adapted, new generations demanded better, and laws reflected those demands. The American story is not just about nostalgia for what we had, but about recognizing how far we've come. Remembering the 1960s is both comforting and sobering. It's a reminder of how much has been lost, the sense of trust, the slower pace of life, the community bonds, but also how much has been gained through awareness, safety, and justice. The decade's legacy is not only in its music, style, and optimism, but in the lessons it left behind. History invites us to reflect, not only on what we miss, but on what we should never want back. The 1960s were a time of bold freedom, but that freedom came with costs. Today, those memories carry both warmth and warning, reminding us that progress is not just changing its protection. Which of these 1960s normals surprised you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below.